Hi everyone, my name is Laine Smith, and today I am presenting my integrative project for the Certificate in Sustainability at the University of Alberta. The topic of my presentation is Sustainable Cities. Can they be measured? I want to explain why I picked this topic. It was actually influenced by a course I took, Buick 488, also known as Business Economics 488. The topic of this course was Sustainable Businesses in Cities, and it was taught to me by Dr. Ike Nwaka. In this, we looked at measurement and indicators and how we can track sustainable cities. I found this really interesting and wanted to learn more about it. Additionally, I'm an operations management major, which is part of the Bachelor of Commerce at the University of Alberta, and this is a very data-driven degree. I wanted to combine my love of data as well as my love of sustainability and specifically look at it in a sustainable cities context. In this presentation today, I'm going to go over an introduction, then I'll look at measurement and indicators, followed by a case study from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and then to end it off, a quick conclusion. One thing I want to note is that this presentation has a Canadian focus. For my introduction, I'm primarily going to look at definitions, including sustainability, cities, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Starting with sustainability, I want to clarify that there are actually three pillars of sustainability, which are environmental, social, and economic. Often when we hear the term sustainability, we just think of the environmental aspect, but all three of these are equally important to create a sustainable city. In my opinion, if you don't have all three pillars, a city is not truly sustainable. You will be able to see all three of these pillars of sustainability in the UN Sustainable Development Goals later in this presentation. Beginning with what is a sustainable city, I wanted to break this down into its parts, beginning with sustainability. I have a definition here from the Brundtland Commission from the UN that defines sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is a generally agreed upon definition of sustainability. Following that up, I have the definition of a city, which is actually not so clear. There's no universal definition of a city. The UN Habitat has proposed looking at defining cities by their urban extent, which is their built up versus open area, or by their degree of urbanization. Legal definitions also vary. For example, in Alberta, a population of over 10,000 is considered a city. I don't want to get too caught up in what the definition of a city is because it really varies where you are in the world. But when I say sustainable cities, really I mean a sustainable urban area. The UN has also considered this, and their Sustainable Development Goal is called Sustainable Cities and Communities, so they've also broadened this. Moving down to the bottom of the slide here, I have a sustainable city. Once again, there's no agreed upon definition of a sustainable city, but some definitions have considered things such as externalities, positive versus negative, and some consider the three pillars of sustainability. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on the three pillars of sustainability, as well as the targets, goals, and indicators created in the SDG 11 of Sustainable Cities and Communities. Well, why does this matter? More than half of the world's population lives in urban areas, and this is expected to grow. So the sustainable development of urban areas is very vital to global sustainable development. Looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, these are 17 goals focused on sustainability. As well, there is an annual SDG report which tracks the progress since their inception in 2016. There's a variety of sustainable development goals. Almost all of them include the three pillars of sustainability. And we see here there's some such as no poverty and quality education. I am going to focus on SDG 11 of Sustainable Cities and Communities. SDG 11 has a goal of making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Under this overarching goal, we have targets. There are 10 targets in total, which cover the three pillars and include things such as slums, public transportation, and waste management. For example, target 11.6 is by 2030, reduce the adverse per capita environmental impact of cities, including by paying special attention to air quality and municipal and other waste management. Under these targets, there are indicators. So each of the 10 targets, except for one, have indicators under them. For example, 11.6.1 is the proportion of municipal solid waste collected and managed in controlled facilities out of total municipal waste generated by cities. These indicators are really important because they're how we measure our targets. So what I've been getting at here is how can we track SDG 11 progress? Through indicators. And what indicators do is they operationalize sustainability goals. This means they turn the goal into something measurable. For the example I looked at earlier, the proportion is the indicator, and that is something that can be measured by a city. This moves me into the second part of my presentation, which is measurement and indicators. I'm going to look at indicators, some challenges with them, and how indicators work in cities. What indicators do is they compile raw data to allow for comparison. This can be geographic comparison, so city to city, or time comparison, so one city over time. This geographic comparison can also be especially important because we can look at how the world is doing in multiple cities across the globe. There are many criteria for what makes up a good indicator, and an indicator should be important to stakeholders, valid and evidence-based, use reliable data, be statistically robust and simple to understand, as well as updatable and locally relevant. This locally relevant means it matters to the local context it's in. So it matters to the geographic context, it matters to the citizens, everything like that. I want to expand on this more, and I'm going to look at localizing data. Localizing data is how you create these locally relevant indicators, and there are two methods to do this. The first is a local to global method, where you align existing indicators and tracking systems up to the SDGs. A pro of this is that it ensures indicators are locally relevant. An example of this is the PEG tracking system, which I'm going to discuss in the case study section. The other method is global to local. So here, we start at the global scale using the SDGs as a starting point to frame your issues, to then create your relevant local indicators. A pro of this is that it's easier to compare with other cities, as your indicators directly follow the SDGs. An example of something that used the global to local method is the StatsCan SDG Data Hub. I now want to look at where indicator data comes from. Data reliability was a key part of a good indicator, and where the data comes from is a key part of that. So indicator data often comes from publicly available data. This is things such as municipal data, provincial data, and StatsCan. However, Thomas et al., what they did is they evaluated many indicators' suitability for measuring SDG 11, and they found that many indicators were unclear about their data source. This makes it tricky to know about the reliability of that data. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not reliable, it makes it harder to track. As well, a lack of data is a primary limitation in action and evaluation of SDG 11. Despite these challenges, we really do need data to measure and track our progress. Next, I'm going to look at some challenges. One note I want to make really clear before I start is that just because there's challenges doesn't mean that we should not track or stop using indicators to track SDG 11. It just means that we can be aware of some of the nuances that make a good indicator. So what I have here is from a chapter from a book called Performance Metrics for Sustainable Cities. This book was edited by Panley and Albert, and there were many chapters written by many different authors. This specific chapter was also written by Panley and Albert. What they did is they compared indicators used in common evaluation systems, and they found that 40 out of 118 indicators were used in only one evaluation system. That's these indicators over here. What this means is that these indicators were so locally relevant that no one else used them, which is great because they clearly matter to the cities they're in, but it also makes it difficult to track geographically. In addition, they found that 36 indicators were used in 3 or more evaluation systems. So these are these indicators here. They defined these as tier 1 indicators and suggested that if cities are just beginning to track their sustainability, they should begin with these tier 1 indicators, as clearly these are indicators which are important to many cities and which there's precedent for tracking. They also found that most commonly used indicators, so those tier 1 indicators, were easy to gather at the city level. So stuff like public transport ridership average that a city can easily track. Summarizing what I talked about, localizing indicators for the relevant urban context means that indicators are useful to that city, which is great, but it also means indicators are hard to aggregate and track across different geographic areas. Additionally, with a lack of indicator consistency, I have that many indicators also lack targets and baselines. So what a target is a specific number of a goal where you're trying to go, and a baseline is where you started. Lacking these makes it really difficult to track progress. Thomas et al. As well, they found that 57% of the indicators they looked at had what they called ambiguous management objectives, which means it's really hard to tell where you're going. My final challenge I have here is indicator relevance to SDG 11. Thomas et al. As well, they looked at 484 indicators, of which only 40% were operationalized to measure an SDG 11 target or indicator. That doesn't mean that the other 60% wasn't tracking good sustainability data. It just means that it wasn't specifically tracked to an SDG 11 goal, which again makes them really hard to compare across cities if everybody's tracking different things. I just want to bring our attention to this bar here, which is target 11.2, affordable and sustainable transport systems. We see that this is a really commonly tracked indicator, which is similar to what we found in the book I looked at earlier, which is that if a city can easily find the data, such as on transport systems, they're more likely to track it. And like I've been getting at, despite challenges, SDG goals are intersectional and comprehensive and are useful in addressing global issues. So we just need to consider these challenges of the indicators and the SDG and use them to create the best indicators we can to track our SDG progress. The final part in this section is how cities and indicators interact. Cities are the sweet spot for change because they're small enough to be adaptable to needs and listen to the voices of citizens, but they're also large enough to have political and financial influence to make action. One study as well found that 65% of SDG goals could not be fully met without the help of local government, which proves the importance of local action at a municipal level and not just at national and international levels. One final consideration in this section is that social and economic actions are often neatly defined by political boundaries, such as cities, that environmental concerns don't follow. So if you consider a bylaw within a city, you'd think the bylaw only affects specifically the city with it's in, but any positive or negative environmental externalities often go beyond just the boundary of that city, which is really important to consider when making action towards these goals. Next, I'm going to look at a case study from Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm looking at a tracking system called PEG, which I first became aware of in the book Performance Metrics for Sustainable Cities, and I've since looked more into the website. What PEG is a community indicator system that measures, monitors, and reports on indicators. It uses a variety of external public data sources, such as StatsCan and the province of Manitoba. So, like we mentioned earlier, it uses these public data sources. It was actually not a government initiative, but instead a partnership between the International Institute of Sustainable Development, the IISD, and the United Way Winnipeg. PEG was created using a local to global strategy. The reason for this is that PEG actually existed prior to the inception of the Sustainable Development Goals. What local experts did is they chose relevant indicators and then narrowed down that indicator list to what is actually tracked by considering the criteria of indicators I listed before, as well as limitations such as collectability and sensitivity. I'm now going to look through the website just to show an example of how it works. It's mypeg.ca if anyone is interested in checking it out. What I've done is hovered over the built environment tab over here and seen many indicators pop up. As well, there are more indicators just not shown on screen. For the focus of this presentation, I'm going to look at dwelling density. After clicking on dwelling density, I see a graph of the Winnipeg average dwelling density and then broken down by community, which gives a great visual of how the city is divided based on dwelling density. I can also select the year range here. If I'm looking at this and wondering what SDG does this relate to, I can click on this SDG tab up here and see that it relates to SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. As well, if I want more description about this data, I can click on the description tab and see a definition of dwelling density, see why it matters, and see measurement and limitations. As well, lower on this screen, there's actually the data source, which is really important. I think mypeg.ca does a really good job of solving some of the limitations we discussed earlier, such as data reliability, by showing where they got their data from, as well as dealing with the challenge of comparing indicators as they relate it to the SDG. This also, again, solves the challenges of indicators not being related to the SDG. I think this is a really great Canadian example of a tracking system that's doing some really great work. I do want to end off with a quick conclusion and summary of what I've talked about today, beginning with considering how many people live in urban areas are very important for sustainable development as a whole. And to continue sustainable development, indicators are key to track progress. One thing I want to note is that using existing indicators can make it easier for a city to start. So there's two ways to do this, like PEG, who used the tracking system and tied them to the SDG, or using those tier 1 indicators I discussed earlier, which means that you can start using something that many other cities are already tracking. As well, despite challenges with indicators, they are still a vital tool for tracking SDG progress. And finally, ending on a positive note here, there are some great examples of local indicators being used to track sustainability, like PEG in Winnipeg. I want to thank everyone for watching and give a special thanks to my certificate advisor, Guillermo, and the academic sustainability coordinator, April. As well, just a shout out to SlidesGo, Flat Icon, and FreePic for the slide template I used for this presentation. I have my references here, here, and here, as well as my photo references. Thank you everybody for watching. I hope you have an amazing day and learn more about sustainable cities and communities.